The morning sun peeked through the windows of Atlanta Memorial Hospital as Sarah Jenkins adjusted her white coat and checked her patient's schedule. At 32 years old, she was one of the most respected physical therapists in the hospital. Her beautiful dark skin glowed with health, and her kind eyes had a way of making every patient feel at ease. That Tuesday morning in March was supposed to be like any other, but fate had different plans. Sarah's colleague, Lisa, rushed into the break room where Sarah was reviewing patient files. "We have a new patient coming in from the accident ward," Lisa said, handing over a thick medical file. "He's been here for 3 weeks recovering from a car crash. Dr. Peterson wants you to handle this case personally." Opening the file, Sarah read the name: Marcus Thompson, 35, software engineer. The accident had left him paralyzed from the waist down. As she flipped through the pages, something about his determined responses during initial assessments caught her attention. At exactly 10:00 a.m., the door to the physical therapy department opened. A nurse wheeled in a man with broad shoulders and intelligent eyes. Despite being confined to the wheelchair, he sat with a dignity that immediately struck Sarah. Marcus Thompson wore a simple gray t-shirt and black track pants, his dark brown hair neatly combed to one side. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," Sarah said, walking over with a warm smile. "I'm Sarah Jenkins, and I'll be your physical therapist." Marcus looked up, and for a moment, he seemed caught off guard. Later, he would tell their friends that it was Sarah's smile that first made his heart skip a beat. "Please call me Marcus," he replied, his voice deeper and more confident than she had expected. As Sarah began the initial assessment, she noticed something different about Marcus. Unlike many patients who were still processing their trauma, he asked intelligent questions about the therapy process. His eyes sparkled with curiosity and determination. "I've read that some patients with similar injuries have regained partial mobility," he said while Sarah tested his upper body strength. "I want to try everything possible. I'm not giving up." Sarah nodded, impressed by his research and attitude. "That's exactly the mindset we need. Recovery is as much about mental strength as it is about physical work." During that first session, they discovered they had more in common than they expected. Both loved Thai food, enjoyed solving puzzles, and shared a passion for old jazz music. The hour passed quickly, filled with exercises, laughter, and conversations that flowed naturally. However, not everyone saw their growing connection positively. Later that afternoon, Sarah overheard two nurses whispering in the corridor. "Did you see how she was with the new patient?" One said. "She needs to maintain professional distance. Plus, he's disabled now. What kind of future could there be?" Sarah's heart sank at their words, but she held her head high and walked past them. She had spent her entire career fighting prejudices, first as a black woman in medicine, and now for believing in her patient's potential for recovery. Over the next few weeks, Marcus never missed a session. He arrived early, often with interesting stories about his work in software engineering or funny observations about hospital life. Sarah found herself looking forward to their sessions more than she wanted to admit. One day, while helping Marcus with his arm exercises, he shared something that touched her deeply. "You know, Sarah, you're different from other therapists I've met. You don't see the wheelchair first. You see me." Sarah paused, meeting his honest gaze. "Because there's so much more to see," she replied simply. Neither of them knew it then, but that moment marked the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. In that bright physical therapy room, surrounded by exercise equipment and the smell of antiseptic, two souls had found an unexpected connection that would soon blossom into something beautiful and extraordinary. As spring turned into summer, Sarah and Marcus's therapy sessions became the highlight of both their days. 3 times a week, they worked together in the sunlit therapy room, where Marcus's determination shone through every exercise. Even on his hardest days, he never complained. Instead, he often made Sarah laugh with his clever jokes and positive attitude. One morning, Sarah walked in to find Marcus typing away on his laptop before their session began. Curious, she peeked at his screen, which showed complex lines of computer code. "Just finishing up some work for my company," Marcus explained, his fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard. "Being in this wheelchair doesn't stop me from creating software. If anything, it's made me more focused." Sarah pulled up a chair beside him. "What kind of software do you make?" Marcus's eyes lit up as he explained his latest project. I'm designing programs that help other disabled people work from home. See? He showed her a beautiful website interface. This will help people with different abilities find remote jobs that match their skills. That's amazing, Sarah said, genuinely impressed. She noticed how passionate he became when talking about helping others. During their therapy sessions, they started sharing more personal stories. Sarah told him about growing up in a small town in Georgia, where she was often the only black student in her science classes. But that never stopped me, she said while helping him with his stretching exercises. If anything, it made me work harder to prove myself. Marcus nodded, understanding. Life has a way of throwing challenges at us. It's how we handle them that matters. One day, during a particularly challenging session, Marcus surprised Sarah by asking about her dreams. I've always wanted to travel the world, she admitted, helping him strengthen his core muscles. Paris, Tokyo, Cape Town. Me too, Marcus said, completing his exercise perfectly. You know, before the accident, I had tickets to visit Thailand. I still want to go someday. Sarah looked at him thoughtfully. What's stopping you? Being in this wheelchair doesn't make things impossible, just more interesting to plan, he replied with a grin. Maybe I'll need a travel buddy who knows about physical therapy. Their eyes met, and both quickly looked away, hiding their smiles. As weeks passed, their professional relationship began showing signs of something deeper. Marcus started bringing 2 cups of coffee to his morning sessions, one black with 2 sugars, just how Sarah liked it. Sarah found herself spending her lunch breaks in Marcus's therapy slot, sharing sandwiches and stories about their lives. The other hospital staff noticed. Some nurses smiled knowingly when Sarah and Marcus laughed together. Others whispered concerns about professional boundaries. Dr. Peterson, the head of the physical therapy department, called Sarah into his office one day. Sarah, he said seriously, I've noticed you're spending a lot of time with Mr. Thompson. Remember to maintain professional distance. Sarah sat straight in her chair. Dr. Peterson, I treat all my patients with the same dedication and respect. Of course, he replied, not unkindly. Just be careful. These situations can get complicated. But nothing felt complicated when she was with Marcus. During one session, while they worked on balance exercises, Marcus shared something that touched her heart deeply. You know what I love about our sessions, he said, gripping the parallel bars. You never make me feel like I'm broken. You see the strength in me, even when I don't see it myself. Sarah felt her heart flutter. That's because you are strong, Marcus, stronger than you know. As she helped him back into his wheelchair, their hands touched briefly. A small moment, but one that sent warmth through both their hearts. Neither said anything, but something had shifted. The journey was no longer just about physical healing. It was becoming a story of 2 hearts finding each other in the most unexpected place. After 3 months of therapy sessions, Sarah and Marcus couldn't deny their feelings anymore. One evening, after his last session of the day, Marcus asked Sarah to have dinner with him at a small Italian restaurant near the hospital. She said yes without hesitation. That first date was magical. Marcus had arranged for a quiet corner table where his wheelchair fit comfortably. They talked for hours, sharing stories about their families and childhood dreams. When Sarah mentioned she was nervous about telling her parents about them, Marcus reached across the table and held her hand. We'll face everything together, he said softly. The next Sunday, Sarah visited her parents' home in the suburbs. Her mother, Mrs. Jenkins, was in the kitchen cooking Sunday dinner while her father read the newspaper in his favorite armchair. Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something, Sarah began, her heart beating fast. I've met someone special. Her parents looked up with interest. Mrs. Jenkins wiped her hands on her apron and sat down. His name is Marcus. He's kind, intelligent, and... Sarah took a deep breath. He's one of my patients at the hospital. He's in a wheelchair after a car accident. The silence that followed felt heavy. Her father folded his newspaper slowly. Sarah, her mother said carefully, you know we support you, but dating a patient, and someone with such challenges. What about children? Her father added. Have you thought about your future? And how will this family feel about you being black? Sarah stood up straighter. Marcus sees me for who I am, and I see him for who he is. His wheelchair doesn't define him, just like my skin color doesn't define me. Meanwhile, Marcus was having a similar conversation with his family. His mother, Mrs. Thompson, had come to his apartment to help with his laundry, a routine she'd started after his accident. A physical therapist. Mrs. Thompson said, folding sheets with quick, nervous movements. Sarah seems lovely, but honey, are you sure? What if she's just feeling sorry for you? Marcus wheeled himself to face his mother. Mom, Sarah is the strongest, most genuine person I know. She doesn't pity me. She challenges me to be better. But the world can be cruel, his mother whispered, tears in her eyes. I don't want either of you to get hurt. Over the next few weeks, both families struggled to accept the relationship. Sarah's younger sister, Tanya, was the first to show support. She came to meet Marcus at the hospital and was charmed by his wit and kindness. I've never seen Sarah so happy, Tanya told their parents later. Isn't that what matters? The turning point came during a chance meeting at the hospital cafeteria. Both mothers had come to visit their children at work and bumped into each other in the lunch line. Mrs. Jenkins and Mrs. Thompson started talking, sharing their worries and hopes for their children. I just want Marcus to be happy, Mrs. Thompson admitted. That's all I want for Sarah, too, Mrs. Jenkins replied softly. They watched through the cafeteria window as Sarah helped Marcus navigate his wheelchair through the busy hallway. The love between them was obvious in their smiles and gentle interactions. Slowly, both families began to see what Sarah and Marcus had known all along, that love doesn't care about wheelchairs or skin color. During a family dinner where both families finally met, Marcus's father raised his glass in a toast. To Sarah and Marcus, he said, his voice thick with emotion, thank you for teaching us that love knows no bounds. Sarah squeezed Marcus's hand under the table. They had faced the first big test of their relationship together, and their love had only grown stronger. As they looked around at their families laughing and sharing stories together, they knew that every challenge was worth it. 6 months into their relationship, Marcus started acting mysterious. He would end phone calls quickly when Sarah entered the room and seemed distracted during their dates. Sarah tried not to worry, but she couldn't help wondering if something was wrong. What Sarah didn't know was that Marcus had been secretly working with Dr. James, another physical therapist at a different hospital. 3 times a week, after his regular therapy with Sarah, Marcus would take a taxi to Dr. James's clinic. There, they worked with experimental robotic leg supports, designed to help people with spinal cord injuries stand and walk for short periods. Are you sure about this? Dr. James asked one day, as Marcus struggled with the supports. The risk of falling is still high. Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead. I've never been more sure of anything. Sarah deserves something special. Meanwhile, Marcus had also been working with Sarah's sister Tanya to plan the perfect proposal. Tanya helped him pick out a beautiful ring, a simple diamond set in white gold, just like Sarah had once mentioned she liked. On a sunny Friday morning, Sarah arrived at work to find a note from Dr. Peterson asking her to handle an emergency therapy session. When she walked into the therapy room, she was surprised to see it decorated with tiny white lights and Sarah's favorite flowers, purple orchids. Marcus sat in his wheelchair in the center of the room, wearing a crisp blue shirt and a nervous smile. Sarah's parents stood to one side with Marcus's family, all holding their phones up to record. Tanya was there too, grinning widely. Marcus? What's going on? Sarah asked, her heart beginning to race. Sarah, Marcus began, his voice full of emotion. This room is where we first met, where you showed me that limitations only exist if we let them. He pressed a button on his wheelchair's arm, and soft jazz music started playing, the same song they had discussed during their first session. You taught me that love doesn't see barriers, Marcus continued. It doesn't see black or white, standing or sitting. It just sees the heart. Then came the moment that made everyone gasp. With Dr. James standing nearby for safety, Marcus activated the robotic supports hidden under his pants. Slowly, carefully, he rose to his feet. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth. Tears filled her eyes as she watched Marcus stand, supported by the innovative technology he'd been secretly practicing with. I wanted to do this the traditional way, Marcus said, his voice shaking slightly as he balanced. Sarah Jenkins, you make me want to achieve the impossible. Your love makes me stronger every day. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring. Dr. James moved closer, ready to help if needed, but Marcus remained steady. Will you marry me? Sarah was crying openly now. She stepped forward, careful not to disturb his balance, and placed her hands on his chest. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times yes. The room erupted in cheers and applause. Marcus carefully slipped the ring onto Sarah's finger before slowly sitting back in his wheelchair. Sarah immediately sat in his lap and kissed him, not caring that their families were filming everything. Later that evening, Tanya uploaded the proposal video to social media. "Love knows no bounds," she wrote as the caption. Within hours, the video went viral. Comments poured in from around the world, with people sharing how the story of Sarah and Marcus touched their hearts. A local news station asked to interview them, and their story was featured on the evening news. "We never meant to become an inspiration," Sarah told a reporter, holding Marcus's hand. "We just fell in love." Marcus squeezed her hand. "But if our story helps others see that love is stronger than any obstacle, then we're happy to share it." That night, as they looked through hundreds of congratulatory messages, Sarah noticed Marcus smiling at her. "What?" she asked. "Just thinking about how lucky I am," he replied, "and how this is just the beginning of our story." The morning of Sarah and Marcus's wedding dawned bright and clear. The garden venue they had chosen was perfect, flat. Paved paths made it easy for Marcus's wheelchair, and the beautiful rose archway provided a stunning backdrop for their ceremony. In the bridal suite, Sarah sat at the dressing table as her sister Tanya helped pin white flowers into her curly hair. Her wedding dress was specially designed, elegant but practical, with a slightly shorter front, so she could dance with Marcus without worrying about the hem. "You look like a queen," Mrs. Jenkins said, wiping tears from her eyes as she helped Sarah with her necklace, a family heirloom passed down through generations. In another room, Marcus was getting ready with his father and best friend Tom. They had practiced for weeks with the robotic leg supports, making sure Marcus could stand confidently for the important moments of the ceremony. "Nervous?" Tom asked, helping Marcus adjust his bow tie. "Not about marrying Sarah," Marcus smiled. "Just hoping the leg supports work perfectly for our first dance." The ceremony was a beautiful blend of both their families' traditions. They had worked hard to make sure every detail was inclusive and meaningful. The aisle was wide enough for wheelchairs, and they had arranged comfortable seating for all 200 guests. As the music started playing, Sarah's father appeared at the entrance. Seeing his daughter in her wedding dress, he had to take a moment to compose himself. "You ready, baby girl?" he asked softly. Sarah squeezed his arm. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life, Dad." The guests stood as Sarah walked down the aisle, but it was Marcus's reaction that made everyone's hearts melt. Tears filled his eyes as he watched his bride approach. With the help of his robotic supports and Tom's steady hand, Marcus slowly rose to his feet. A collective gasp of joy went through the crowd. Sarah's steps faltered for a moment as emotion overwhelmed her, seeing Marcus standing tall, waiting for her under the rose arch. The minister spoke about love that overcomes all obstacles, but many guests later said they were too moved by the couple's obvious devotion to hear the exact words. When it came time for their vows, Marcus spoke first. "Sarah," he said, his voice strong and clear, "you saw me when others looked away. You loved me not despite my challenges, but with them as part of who I am. I promise to spend every day trying to be worthy of that love." Sarah's voice shook as she replied, "Marcus, you taught me that love has no limitations except those we place on it ourselves. I promise to be your partner, your support, and your best friend, every step of our journey together." The highlight of the reception was their first dance. Marcus and Sarah had practiced for months with their dance instructor, creating a beautiful wheelchair waltz. But Marcus had a surprise planned. Halfway through the song, he activated his supports again. "May I have this dance?" he asked, standing and holding out his hand. Sarah stepped into his arms, and they swayed together as the song at last played softly. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. Mrs. Thompson and Mrs. Jenkins held hands, both crying happy tears as they watched their children. Later, during the reception, Dr. James, who had helped Marcus with the robotic supports, raised a toast to Sarah and Marcus, who remind us that love doesn't just overcome obstacles, it refuses to see them as obstacles at all. As the evening wound down, Sarah and Marcus took a moment alone in the garden. Fairy lights twinkled above them, and the sound of their guests laughing and celebrating drifted out from the reception. "Mrs. Thompson," Marcus said softly, playing with Sarah's new ring. "Yes, Mr. Thompson," she replied, leaning down to kiss him. "Ready for our next adventure?" Sarah smiled, thinking of their honeymoon plans. "With you, always." Neither of them knew then that their biggest adventure and surprise was still to come. The day after their wedding, Sarah and Marcus prepared for their dream honeymoon to the Maldives. They had spent months planning every detail to make sure the journey would be comfortable for Marcus. Their specially equipped van, rented from a disability-friendly travel service, stood ready in their driveway. "Did you pack all your medications?" Sarah asked, going through their checklist one final time. Even on her honeymoon, her caring nature as a physical therapist showed through. "Yes, dear," Marcus smiled, watching his new wife flutter around the house. "And the spare battery for the robotic supports, extra cushions, and all 3 backup phone chargers." Their families had gathered to see them off. Mrs. Thompson fussed over Marcus's travel pillow while Mrs. Jenkins helped Sarah pack the last few snacks for the road. The drive to Atlanta International Airport would take about 2 hours, and they wanted to be prepared for anything. "Now remember," Tom said as he loaded the last suitcase, "I installed that new GPS system in the van. It'll show you the best routes with accessible rest stops." Sarah's sister Tanya hugged them both. "And I've called ahead to every stop on your itinerary. They're all ready for you with wheelchair access." The van was perfect for their needs. It had a special ramp for Marcus's wheelchair, extra space for their luggage, and comfortable seats that could be adjusted if Marcus needed to stretch. The air conditioning was already running, keeping the temperature just right. "Text us when you get to the airport," both mothers called out as Sarah climbed into the driver's seat. Marcus was already secured in the passenger side, his wheelchair safely stored in the back. "And don't forget to send pictures from the Maldives," Tanya added, waving excitedly. As they pulled away from their house, Sarah reached over and squeezed Marcus's hand. "Can you believe it? We're actually married." "Best decision I ever made," Marcus replied, bringing her hand to his lips for a kiss. The first hour of their journey was perfect. They listened to their favorite jazz playlist, talked about the wedding highlights, and shared their excitement about the water villa they had booked in the Maldives. The resort had assured them it was fully accessible, with ramps and special water wheelchairs for Marcus to enjoy the ocean. "I can't wait to see the sunset from our private deck," Sarah said dreamily. The pictures looked amazing. Marcus watched her face light up as she talked about their plans. "You know what I'm most excited about?" he asked. "What's that?" "Just being alone with my wife. No more hospital schedules, no more therapy sessions, no more family dropping by to help. Just us." Sarah smiled, touched by his words. They had both been so busy with wedding preparations and work that quiet moments together had been rare lately. As they approached the halfway point of their journey, dark clouds started gathering overhead. The weather forecast hadn't mentioned rain, but Georgia weather was always unpredictable. "Maybe we should stop at the next rest area," Sarah suggested, noticing the increasingly heavy clouds. "Wait out the rain if it gets too heavy." Marcus checked their GPS. "There's one coming up in about 10 minutes. We got plenty of time before our flight." The first few raindrops hit the windshield just as Sarah spotted a sign for the rest stop. She slowed down, being extra careful on the wet road. Neither of them was too worried. They had planned for every possibility. But sometimes life has its own plans. As they turned onto the exit ramp, neither of them could have known that the next few minutes would change their lives forever. The simple journey to their honeymoon was about to become much more extraordinary than either of them had imagined. The rain was falling harder now as Sarah carefully guided their van along the exit ramp. The windshield wipers worked at full speed, but visibility was still poor. Suddenly, they hit something, a deep pothole hidden under a puddle of rainwater. "Oh!" Sarah exclaimed as the van jolted. "Are you okay, Marcus?" But Marcus didn't answer immediately. His face had gone completely white, and his hands were gripping the armrests of his seat. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Sarah, I felt that." "What do you mean?" she asked, already pulling into the rest stop parking lot. "The jolt. I felt it in my legs. I shouldn't be able to feel anything below my waist, but I felt it." Sarah's medical training kicked in immediately. She parked the van under the covered area of the rest stop and turned on the interior lights. As a physical therapist, she knew this could be significant, but she didn't want to get their hopes up too quickly. "I'm going to try something," she said, keeping her voice calm despite her racing heart. "Close your eyes, Marcus. Don't look at your legs. Just tell me if you feel anything." Using her professional touch, Sarah gently pressed different points on Marcus's legs, starting from his thighs and working her way down. Her hands were trembling slightly, but years of medical training kept them steady enough. "There," Marcus exclaimed. "I felt that. It was faint, but I definitely felt pressure on my right knee." Tears started forming in Sarah's eyes, but she forced herself to remain professional. She tried more pressure points, carefully documenting in her phone which areas had sensation and which didn't. "Marcus," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion, "this could mean your paralysis is incomplete. Some nerve pathways might still be intact. We need to get you to a specialist right away." Marcus grabbed her hand. "But our honeymoon, the Maldives, all our plans." Sarah shook her head, smiling through her tears. "This is more important. The Maldives will always be there." They called their families from the rest stop. Within minutes, both sets of parents and Tanya were on their way. Sarah also called Dr. Peterson, who immediately contacted Dr. Harrison, one of the best neurological specialists in Atlanta. "Get him to Atlanta Medical Center," Dr. Peterson instructed. "Dr. Harrison will meet you there." While they waited for their families, Sarah and Marcus sat in the van, holding hands and trying to process what was happening. The rain continued to fall outside, but neither of them noticed anymore. "Did you ever suspect?" Sarah asked softly. "In all our therapy sessions?" Marcus shook his head. "There were times I thought I felt something, but I convinced myself it was just wishful thinking. I didn't want to hope." Sarah squeezed his hand. "Hope is exactly what we need right now." Their families arrived within the hour, creating a small convoy of cars. Mrs. Thompson was crying, and Mrs. Jenkins was already on the phone canceling their honeymoon arrangements. "The resort said they'll let you rebook any time within the next year," she told them. "No extra charge." As they drove to Atlanta Medical Center, Marcus kept testing his legs, reporting every tiny sensation to Sarah. Sometimes he felt nothing, but other times he could definitely feel pressure or movement. "Even if it's just partial sensation," Sarah explained to their families, "it could mean everything. With the right therapy and treatment. And I have the best physical therapist in the world," Marcus added, making Sarah blush. They arrived at the hospital just as Dr. Harrison was walking in. The specialist had canceled his afternoon appointments to see them immediately. As the nurses helped Marcus onto an examination bed, Sarah held his hand tightly. "Whatever happens next," she whispered, "we're in this together." Marcus smiled at his new wife. "Our honeymoon might not be in the Maldives, but this could be the beginning of an even more amazing journey." Dr. Harrison spent 2 hours running tests on Marcus that evening. Sarah never left her husband's side, her medical knowledge helping her understand every test and procedure. Finally, the doctor called both families into his office to explain his findings. "Mr. Thompson," Dr. Harrison began, pointing to several images on his computer screen, "you have what we call an incomplete spinal cord injury. Some nerve pathways are still intact, something that was missed in your initial diagnosis." Marcus squeezed Sarah's hand as the doctor continued. "With intensive rehabilitation, there's a real possibility you could regain some function in your legs. I can't promise you'll walk normally again, but even partial recovery could significantly improve your quality of life." Mrs. Thompson started crying happy tears, while Marcus's father stood quietly, his hand on his wife's shoulder. Sarah's parents hugged each other, and Tanya was already filming everything on her phone. "When can we start?" Marcus asked, his voice full of determination. Dr. Harrison smiled. "I've already called the best rehabilitation center in Atlanta. They're expecting you tomorrow morning. You'll need to commit to at least 6 months of intensive therapy." Sarah stood up straighter. "I'll take leave from work. I want to be part of every session." Over the next few months, their story spread across the country. The video of their wedding, combined with updates about Marcus's progress, inspired millions. News stations wanted to interview them, and disability rights organizations asked them to speak at events. Marcus worked harder than he ever had before. Every day brought new challenges, but also new hopes. Some days, he could barely move his toes. Other days, he managed to stand for several seconds without the robotic supports. Sarah was there for every triumph and setback. She used her skills as a physical therapist to help him at home after his regular therapy sessions. Their living room became a mini rehabilitation center, filled with exercise equipment and therapy tools. 3 months into their rehabilitation journey, Marcus surprised everyone during a therapy session. With Sarah spotting him between parallel bars, he took his first unassisted step in over a year. "I did it," he exclaimed, tears running down his face. Sarah was crying too. "You did it, my love. You really did it." Tanya, who had been visiting that day, captured the moment on video. This time, when the video went viral, it was even bigger than their proposal video. People from around the world sent messages of support and hope. 6 months after their discovery in the rain, Marcus could take several steps with a walker. It wasn't easy, and he still used his wheelchair most of the time, but it was more than anyone had thought possible a year ago. On their first wedding anniversary, instead of being in the Maldives, they celebrated at home with their families. Marcus had another surprise planned. With his walker decorated with fairy lights, he slowly made his way across their living room to where Sarah sat. "Dance with me?" he asked, standing carefully. Sarah stood and wrapped her arms around him. As they swayed gently to the same song from their wedding, the families watched with joy. Mrs. Thompson and Mrs. Jenkins held hands, just like they had at the wedding, both crying happy tears again. Later that evening, Marcus and Sarah sat on their back porch, looking at the stars. Their postponed honeymoon to the Maldives was finally booked for the following month. "You know," Marcus said, holding his wife close, "that rainy day turned out to be the biggest blessing of our lives." Sarah smiled. "Besides meeting you, you mean?" "Meeting you, marrying you, and then discovering this miracle. All because you saw me as a person, not a patient. You saw possibilities when others saw limitations. And look at us now," Sarah said softly, "still proving that love knows no bounds." Their story became a symbol of hope for many others. People often asked them if they regretted missing their original honeymoon. Sarah and Marcus always gave the same answer: "Sometimes the best journeys are the ones you never planned to take."